This awkward-looking but oddly charming little vehicle is capable of outperforming the LuAZ, the Neva, and even the Hummer in deep mud. It began its life with the Soviet airborne forces, then spent long and hard years in the rural countryside, later tried to become more civilized, and eventually dropped out of the race in the 1990s without ever gaining real recognition. And, as sometimes happens with artists, but almost never with cars, genuine popular appreciation came only after that finale. Today, we're talking about a unique off-road vehicle from Ukraine, the LuAZ Volyn. And if you're tired of plastic pseudo-SUVs with screens covering the entire dashboard, this small, honest vehicle will definitely appeal to you. LuAZ is located in western Ukraine. It is the administrative center of the Volyn region, a relatively small city with a long and complex history. The same can be said about the LuAZ automobile plant. It never aimed for large-scale production, but it still managed to leave a noticeable mark on automotive history. It all began almost by accident. In the 1950s, local repair workshops were first reorganized into an auto repair plant, and later into a machine-building facility. The factory produced agricultural equipment and trailers, repaired trucks, and built specialized bodies for them. And most likely, that would have been the end of the story. The plant would have remained one of hundreds of obscure Soviet enterprises, if not for one circumstance that, at first glance, had nothing to do with it. By the late 1950s, the Soviet Union had clearly identified a need for a small, four-wheel drive vehicle intended for rural use. The first work in this direction began in 1956 and led to the creation of the NAMI 032, a compact, multi-purpose off-road vehicle with an open body and components borrowed from the M72 motorcycle. Its dual-purpose designation meant that it could be used both by the military and in civilian roles. The civilian branch of this concept, however, quickly reached a dead end. Several prototypes were built, but mass production was deemed impractical. The military direction, on the other hand, proved far more successful. After analyzing the experience of operating various types of equipment during the Korean War, the Soviet Ministry of Defense issued a new technical requirement. The military needed a light amphibious all-terrain vehicle with high ground clearance, a machine capable of transporting wounded soldiers, being airdropped from aircraft, and operating within combat units that worked in very close proximity to the enemy. And at that point, the already existing NAMI 032 chassis turned out to be a perfect fit. It was chosen as the foundation for the project. The first amphibious prototype was presented to the military in 1957. It is worth noting that the engineering team, led by Boris Fitterman, approached the development of the future military vehicle with clear enthusiasm. Their prototype looked unexpected. It was styled in a way that felt distinctly unmilitary, and its exterior even showed design cues reminiscent of the Zim executive sedan. The military, however, considered such solutions unnecessary. They demanded that the vehicle be brought into what they described as a more normal form. In 1961, a simplified version of the amphibian was presented. The simplification mostly affected the exterior, because from a technical standpoint, the vehicle actually received a number of revisions and restrictions. To solve balance issues during water operation, the driver's seat was placed strictly in the center of the hull, with a medic seated behind. Stretchers for wounded soldiers were positioned along the sides. Movement in water relied entirely on the paddling effect of the wheels. This time, the military was satisfied. Initially, production of the amphibious vehicle was planned at the Urbit motorcycle plant, the same facility that supplied the engines. However, during preliminary trials, it became clear that the motorcycle engine was underpowered. It was replaced with an air-cooled V4 engine with a displacement of 0.8 liters and an output of 27 horsepower, the same engine used in the Zaporozhet's passenger cars. From a logistical standpoint, transferring production to the Zaporozhye automobile plant seemed like the obvious next step. But the factory was already operating at full capacity and could not absorb another model. As a result, the search for a new production site began. That site turned out to be the LuAZ mechanical plant. The vehicle that entered production in LuAZ was officially designated as the LuAZ 967. However, in military documentation, it was referred to simply as the TPK, short for transporter of the forward edge. Its primary mission was to evacuate wounded soldiers directly from the front line, as well as to deliver ammunition and medical supplies under combat conditions. The driver could operate the vehicle while seated, lying down, or even walking alongside it, a feature intended for situations where the intensity of combat made conventional driving impossible or too dangerous. The military took a liking to the TPK. It remained in production from 1969, the year it was officially adopted into service, all the way until 1989. Most vehicles were delivered to airborne units, where its specific capabilities were especially valuable. There were also attempts to develop a three-axle version based on the TPK. However, the project never progressed beyond a handful of experimental prototypes. Attempts to adapt military vehicles for civilian use have been made in many countries and at different times. But in the Soviet Union, this approach was often not just an option. It was almost the only way to mechanize rural life and move farmers from horses to motor vehicles. And it was precisely the TPK that became the foundation for a future off-road vehicle known as the Volin. Amphibious capability was, of course, abandoned. The driver and passengers were seated in a more civilian layout. The canvas roof was supplemented with removable canvas side panels, and the new vehicle received a simple, no-nonsense design. The engine, inherited from the TPK concept, was slightly more powerful, 30 horsepower with a displacement of 0.9 liters. In almost every other respect, this rural Jeep remained essentially the same TPK. The first 30 examples, designated ZaZ 969, were built in Zaporizhia in 1964. In Lutsk, the design was then refined into a production-ready form and entered series production in 1967. During this process, the styling was revised, giving the vehicle a more distinctly civilian appearance. Interestingly, from a purely technical standpoint, the LuAZ 969 can be considered the first Soviet front-wheel drive automobile. It featured front-wheel drive with a connectable rear axle. Moreover, by the time series production began, the Melitopol engine plant had not yet been able to supply rear axle reduction gearboxes for the new model. As a result, the vehicle initially entered production as a front-wheel drive-only car. To distinguish this configuration, the letter V was added to the model designation. By the early 1970s, more than 7,000 front-wheel drive LuAZ vehicles had been produced, after which supply issues were resolved and the vehicle received full four-wheel drive. During the Soviet period, several attempts were made to improve the vehicle, and it would be unfair to say they were unsuccessful. In 1975, the Volin received an updated engine, producing 40 horsepower, and 4 years later, in 1979, the LuAZ 969M entered series production, the M standing for modernized. The changes were substantial. The updated model featured a dual-circuit braking system with a booster on the front axle, a redesigned front end, a new windshield shape, proper frame doors instead of simple canvas panels, a plastic dashboard, and seats borrowed from Lada passenger cars. In short, the new LuAZ was noticeably transformed in almost every respect. The main users of LuAZ vehicles were agricultural workers, machine operators, and mid-level managers. Even within this environment, there was a clear hierarchy, much like among regular officials. LuAZ vehicles were also supplied to veterinary services, geological exploration teams, rural medical workers, foresters, and postal workers operating in the countryside. Most surprisingly, the LuAZ could be purchased legally for private ownership without any special permits, and, even more unusually, often with little or no waiting time. The reason was simple. In urban conditions, the Volin was difficult to live with, while rural residents often lack both the financial means and the practical need for such a vehicle. In villages, people typically traveled on foot, by bicycle, or by moped, and a car was often unnecessary simply because there was nowhere to drive it. As a result, among the famously long Soviet waiting lists for automobiles, there was at least one notable exception. When it comes to operating the LuAZ on paved roads rather than off-road, one particular first-hand account is worth quoting. It comes from a test driver who drove a LuAZ under its own power from Lutsk to Tolyatti, a journey of nearly 2,300 kilometers. The engine is rather weak, 40 horsepower, Because of this, the designers were forced to brutally increase the transmission gear ratios just to make the vehicle move at all. First gear reminded me of a tank. The engine is screaming, and the vehicle barely crawls forward. I shift into second, almost the same thing. Only in fourth gear does it start to resemble actual driving. Later, it turned out that you could even pull away from a standstill in fourth gear without much effort, provided the road was flat or downhill. Driving the Volan on highways over long distances is not an activity for the faint-hearted. Uphill or downhill, it simply cannot go faster than 60 kilometers per hour. There's only one way to survive it: steady, uninterrupted driving. Over time, you fall into a rhythm, stopping only to refuel. This was one of the key reasons why there were virtually no waiting lists for the LuAZ. Normal operation in urban conditions was close to impossible. The management of the LuAZ automobile plant understood this perfectly, which is why a decision was made to begin development of a new vehicle, one that would be just as capable off-road, but also usable in the city, especially since they already had a clear example in front of them: the Lada Niva. In 1984, a new vehicle was developed in LuAZ that retained the existing platform but featured a completely new plastic body. It was intended to become the LuAZ 1301. For nearly a decade, the project was repeatedly revised and improved, but chronic lack of funding made series production impossible. The car was shown at exhibitions, periodically resurfaced in the press, and even received a tentative production date of 2002, along with a public competition to name it, yet it never reached the assembly line. A similar fate awaited an alternative version developed in 1988 by an initiative group from NAMI's Leningrad-based Advanced Vehicle Prototyping Laboratory. Their project, known as the LuAZ Proto, featured a more progressive plastic body, a 6-speed gearbox, a Tavria engine, an original drivetrain layout, and an integrated tilting front end. Despite its modern appearance, it also remained a prototype. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the situation became unavoidable. As economic ties collapsed and state orders disappeared, LuAZ failed to introduce a new off-road vehicle and was forced to continue with its aging design. The model survived in updated form as the LuAZ 1302, fitted with a 53-horsepower, liquid-cooled Tavria engine, which noticeably improved performance both on and off the road. Even so, demand in independent Ukraine remained minimal. The state no longer purchased LuAZ vehicles, and private buyers showed little interest. Cargo and dump truck variants were developed in an attempt to attract farmers, but the outcome was already clear. The LuAZ had reached the end of its development path, and its original design had no real future. The last LuAZ vehicles of the original concept were assembled in 2002. During the Soviet period from 1966 to 1989, LuAZ produced approximately 182,000 vehicles. By automotive industry standards, this was not a large number, especially considering that the factory itself consisted of only a few small workshops and became known almost entirely for a single civilian model. And it truly became known. The Volan was loved and hated in equal measure. There were no indifferent opinions. Even in Soviet times, much of that criticism was justified. Comfort was virtually non-existent, and operating conditions were genuinely Spartan, closer to a tractor than a passenger car. Real public appreciation came only after production had ended. Among people interested in outdoor activities and off-roading, the LuAZ was suddenly seen in a different light. Its main advantage became obvious: price. It was a small but fully capable off-road vehicle, significantly cheaper than the Lada Niva or the Suzuki Jimny, and an excellent base for off-road modification. Naturally, growing interest pushed prices upward. Today, a reasonably decent LuAZ, regardless of year, typically sells for around $1,500 to $2,000, while modified or heavily prepared examples can cost several times more. The most sought-after version, of course, is the TPK. Yet this military amphibian is rarely seen on the open market, and those who managed to acquire one in the past are usually reluctant to part with it. After ending production of its own off-road vehicle, the LuAZ automobile plant shifted to assembling Lada cars, a role it continued to play until 2014. This is how the story of one of the strangest and most controversial Soviet off-road vehicles came to an end. A machine misunderstood in its own time and appreciated far too late.